So thank you so much, Evan, for inviting me to give this paper today, and to June for all of her organising as well. It's a real pleasure to come and speak to you. I've kind of heard about the Rare Books Group for a long time, but I suppose I'm a bit of an art historian interloper in libraries and special collections as well. I think I probably have met some of you over the years, but just to tell you a little bit about myself, first of all. So I'm an art historian who has ended up over the years working in several special collections units, starting with the Cruikshank Lynn archive in the Irish Art Research Centre in Trinity College, later then at the Centre for the Study of Irish Art in the National Gallery of Ireland, and most recently and at the moment in special collections in the UCD Library. So I suppose I come at this topic, or the idea of special collections, from two sides, both as someone who has worked in the reading room and worked with researchers and with the collections as I suppose a facilitator, but also then as a researcher as well, working on my own projects over the years, and I suppose most particularly on Painting Dublin, which I'm going to talk about today, which was a book based on my PhD research, but that came out as a book in December 2020, published by Manchester University Press. So just to give kind of an outline of what I'm going to speak about today, I'm going to give a very short introduction to the book, then following that, an overview, I suppose, of some of my research process and where special collections came into that, and then finally go through a couple of different examples, which I hope you'll find interesting, both from a special collections and just an art history perspective as well. So I've started here with this beautiful watercolor by James Mahoney from the National Gallery's collection, and this is the image that both is on the cover of the book and which opens the book with a kind of close look and a description of it. It was painted from the spire of St. George's Church on Hardwick Place, which is the church just beside the Mater Hospital now, and we're looking out over Dublin in the middle of the 19th century. And you can see O'Connell Street here, the gardens of the Rotunda here, where we see the little mass of the ships up the river, and of course then the boats going to and fro across the Irish Sea. And what drew me to this image and why I used it to frame the book is that it just gives you such a great sense of what is happening at the city at that time. It's full of details in terms of the architecture, and particularly the imperial architecture and sculpture of the city, but also, and again, you can't really see it on the slide, but when we look over here, we see the glass palace built for the Irish Industrial Exhibition, and so we're moving into a new period of Irish history there as well. So with the book, I look really at the history of the city between 1886 and 1949, and those dates reflect, I suppose, the change in Irish history from that period, from the failure of the Third Home Rule Bill in 1886, right the way through to the Republic of Ireland Act in 1949, which we see kind of celebrated here in this wonderful photograph by Larry Burrows. Of course, so much changes in that time. And if we look at a painting like this by Richard Thomas Moynihan, The Death of the Queen, we move from a Dublin that is, I suppose, a city of empire and with its kind of unionist politics through 1916. This a work by Edmond Delren, a Belgian refugee who came to Dublin to escape the war and found himself in the middle of another one. And of course, underlying all of this is the ongoing kind of social issues in the city. So it's very much framing the history of Dublin and the depiction of the city by artists within this changing historical context. So where do books come into this, and where do special collections come into this? Well, when I started this research, and what I suppose drew me to it in the first place, was that when we think of Dublin in terms of its cultural representation, we're all, I suppose, quite familiar with the literary city, the poetic city, the city on stage, and I suppose to some extent the city in music as well. But where do we find the artistic, and I mean in the fine art sense, the paintings, the prints, the drawings of Dublin? So one of the first things I had to do was to establish a corpus for the city. What artists were significant? How had images of the cities been used? Where does it intersect with these wider social and political narratives? And the book seemed, you know, in addition to galleries and museum collections, the book was an obvious place to start because, of course, the artist who many of us are familiar with when it comes to Dublin is James Malton. And while we think of maybe Malton today as an artist whose works are reproduced on placemats and coasters and, you know, kind of bric-a-brac, this, of course, started its life as a series of prints bound together in a folio or book. And there's a very beautiful example of this in UCD special collections. So the book seemed very important, and it would really shape the artist that I chose for the book and the type of narrative I wanted to tell. So I should have just said as well that Painting Dublin looks at 6 artists. I'm only going to look at some of them today, but they are 5 artists. Walter Osborne, who painted this glorious scene of the vendor of books on the quays. Rose Barton, who we'll look at in more detail now in a few minutes, Jack B. Yates, Harry Kernoff, Estella Solomons, and Flora Mitchell as well. So they bring us through that sweep of the late 19th and early 20th century. So we'll start with a look at Rose Barton. Sorry, I think I must have deleted a slide, but that's not to worry. Rose Barton is an artist that you may be familiar with. She has one very well-known watercolour called Going to the Levee, which shows carriages going into Dublin Castle. And it's her depiction of Dublin Castle that, you know, really she's best known for, and depicting the different ceremonies of the castle politics, the levees, the changing of the guard, and these other kind of ceremonial occasions. This was very much the background that Barton herself came from. She was born in April 1856. So we see this photograph here from 1896 when she's roughly about 40 years old and very well established as an artist. Her family very much leaned unionist in its politics. They're involved in the law, in the army, and are very much part of the Dublin Castle social circle. Rose herself, as a young woman, was presented at court, and her works were frequently purchased by the Viceroy and other figures from around the same social circle. And the thing about Barton is that even though she's quite well known, she's well established, there are very few archives, papers, letters, diaries, etc. relating to her. And so one of the things I came across very early on in my research was a book called Picturesque Dublin, Old and New, written by Francis Gerard and published in 1898 by Hutchinson and Company, a London-based publisher. This was a book telling the story of the history of Dublin, and it included a number of artworks, around 30 artworks by Barton, as well as other reproductions from old engravings, etc. The book had a focus on Old Dublin, and Old Dublin was used as a term to really refer to the area not just within the canals, the traditional boundary of the city, but the area around the 2 cathedrals, the Liberties, and the part of the city that in the late 19th century was both quite down at heel, but also about to undergo a huge redevelopment through the auspices of the Guinness family as well. Barton had completed numerous kind of depictions of Patrick Street, looking up here, as you see, towards Christchurch, as well as down the other way towards St. Patrick's as well. This was an illustration that was reproduced by Barton for Picturesque Dublin. So I was using this book and its illustrations, I suppose, to add to this body of artists who had depicted the city. And this book, you'll find it in a lot of collections. It's not rare, I suppose, by any means. But Barton's illustrations for it are intriguing, particularly, as I say, her depictions of old Dublin. So things like Huguenot houses in the Liberties and Weavers' Hall. So parts of the city that just aren't there anymore. These were reproduced for the books. They were photolithographs from original illustrations. And one thing kind of very exciting find that I did have was finding some of these original watercolors by the artist during the course of my research. So in 1955, Barton's nephew, a man called Raymond Brooke, gifted a set of artworks to the Dublin Civic Museum, and these were later transferred to Dublin City Archives. And among them were 10 original illustrations for picturesque Dublin, including these two here, which you'll hopefully recognize from the previous page. They are works in watercolor and gouache on paper. And I suppose they're an unusual thing to find because often artworks at this period that were used to make mechanical reproductions from were later destroyed. So these are a really interesting survivor and tell us something about the relationship between the artist, the book, and the public that they were aiming the book at as well. So as a 19th century example, picturesque Dublin very much tells the story of Dublin as a loyal city of empire. And that is, coming from Barton's background, and the same for Gerard as well. But what about then when we come to the 20th century? Well, we start to get into quite a different period, both in terms of publishing history, artistic style, and also the type of artists that we're looking at as well. So I popped this very well-known painting in just to kind of get our heads moving from the 19th into the 20th century. This is Jack B. Yeats' painting The Liffey Swim from 1923. It's such a fast-moving, colourful, vibrant painting. We have our crowds of people here gathered along the quays, people in the trams, O'Connell Bridge, and our swimmers in the water as well. This painting is often presented and is very much seen as the city after the turmoil and the strife of the revolutionary period. So after 1916, after 1921, and obviously after then the end of the Civil War as well. It has the honour of being the artwork which won the Independent Free State's first Olympic medal, winning silver in Paris in the Cultural Olympiad in 1924 as well. So it's very much an image that symbolises the ambitions of the Irish Free State in the post-Civil War period. And of course, Yeats was not the only artist who was drawn into this kind of celebratory period. And there's a really interesting overlap between visual art and publication history in this period through a number of books that came out in the late 1920s and into the 1930s. So they are the Civic Week handbooks, the 1929 Book of Dublin, which we'll look at in a moment. And of course, then the kind of culmination of this is the Irish Free State Handbook with its wonderful cover by Art O'Murnaghan, published in 1934. I'm not going to look at that today, but much of what I'm saying kind of holds true for that as well. So the Dublin Civic Weeks in 1927 and 1929 were part of this flurry of public events to promote the city, to promote Irish history, industry, art and culture in the first decade of the Irish Free State. They were based around kind of public events, pageantry. You have theatre, military tattoos, costume balls, and all again, trying to bring, I suppose, people together and get this sense of a new type of Ireland. And the books, I suppose, a lot of this was ephemeral. but the books have become a real kind of lasting legacy of this period. So this is the cover here of the 1927 Civic Week handbook. It was published by Colm O'Loughlin of the Sign of the Three Candles Press. And of course, O'Loughlin was kind of a key figure in the kind of Irish publishing at this period. In 1927, the artist Paul Henry chaired the art committee for the Civic Week. And so you have a cover here by Stella Stein, who is one of the very few, in fact, maybe of one or two Irish artists who goes to the Bauhaus to train in this period. And then on the inside, you have a book that is filled with illustrations by notable artists from the 1920s. So for example, Maurice McGonagall, Sean O'Sullivan, Harry Kurnoff, who we're going to look at, Stella Solomons, and Flora Mitchell as well, who became key to my research. But there are others, of course, as well, such as Harry Walsh, George Monks, a real mix of people whose legacies, I suppose, have lasted, and other people who it's quite hard to find information on. So this, you'll see, is very typical of the type of illustrations for the 1927 Civic Week book. We have O'Connell Street from a pencil sketch by H. Kurnoff, seen from the bridge of O'Connell Street. Seen from the bridge of O'Connell Street can claim to be one of the finest streets in Europe. So these books were very much about selling a very positive image of the city. It's a beautiful illustration. We have that very distinctive Dublin lamp here, which you'll still see around the city today. Nelson's Pinner, something you won't see today. Cleary's here, the trams, and of course the O'Connell Monument as well. It's not just the grand streets and boulevards that are depicted. We have here the Leinster Market, and this is a reproduction from an etching by Stella F. Solomons. And they say this old-fashioned byway runs between Dunleer Street and the Theatre Royal. It is an interesting remnant of the old Dublin, which is now passing. So we have, again, this evocation of old Dublin, of a city that is constantly changing, and that's important. And then, just to give you another example, we have two reproductions here from etchings by Flora Mitchell, taking in the ornamental lake of Stephen's Green and the Royal College of Surgeons. And here we have government buildings, Marion Street, from an etching by Flora Mitchell, originally the Royal College of Science, now the seat of most of the administrative offices of the Irish government. So I think these are very purposefully chosen sites around the city. Of course, RCSI for its role in the 1916 Rising, and this such an imposing building here, formerly the College of Science, and now it's transformed into part of Ireland's kind of legislative and political independence as well. This there was another Civic Week handbook produced in 1929, slightly different from its 1927 counterpart. So many of the same artists were involved. So you see MG here, this is an illustration by Maurice McGonagall, and the decorative border here was designed by Harry Kurnoff. But this Civic Week handbook didn't have that same type of individual illustration by artists. I think because in the same year, Bulmer Hobson, who had edited the two Civic Week handbooks, also produces this, a book of Dublin. So something focusing particularly on the city itself. So again, here we see the same artist popping up again. We have Dunleary Harbour from a drawing by Flora Mitchell. Kurnoff contributed 3 illustrations to this, the Jacob's Biscuit Factory, and the Great Grain Silo at the Dublin Port, and we have a view here of the Watling Street and the Guinness Brewery. So very much again about the industry of the city. Stella Solomons, again, in her very characteristic way, is a view of the Rotunda Hospital. And I suppose just it was maybe something that had a particular interest to her, because in 1926, her brother Bethel Solomons had been made master of the Rotunda, a position which he held for many years. And again, a sense of the changing architecture of Dublin. We have the Governor General's house in Phoenix Park. Of course, we recognise it now as Áras an Uachtaráin. It had been the Viceregal Lodge, and then became the Áras and the House of the President of Ireland in 1932. So we get all of these cycles of change gathered together in these very kind of carefully curated and highly produced books on Dublin. So that was a really important step for me in approaching this topic, to see what artists had been selected and who there was kind of repeat images from. And when it came then to kind of shaping that into a book, it would kind of help me choose what artists I was going to focus on. Definitely the artists that I look at are not the only ones by any stretch who are painting Dublin, who are depicting the city, but something that would shape a narrative and hopefully make quite an interesting read. So in the end, Curnoff, Solomons and Mitchell all made the cut. So I'll just spend the kind of last little part of my time today just to introduce you to these artists and tell you a little bit about them. So the first artist here is Harry Curnoff. This is a photo from around 1921 from his papers in the National Library. He became quite a distinctive figure around Dublin because of this fedora hat that he often wore and often portrayed himself wearing in a number of self-portraits. Curnoff already, even as before he really became known as an artist, had such an affinity for wood, for working with wood and for the woodcut, and would go on to produce 3 of his own publications of woodcuts, published by the Talbot Press, one by the Three Candles Press, and then one which he published privately himself. His work often focused on the working class and the labour history of Dublin. So, for example, here we have Os Obair, or Unemployed. This was a portrait of a man called Jack O'Neill, who was part of the unemployed trade union movement, and who Curnoff actually travelled to the USSR with in the 1930s. And he pops up in many of his paintings. You often see that commitment again to the industrial side of Dublin through a work like this, showing the Dublin docks, which he completed in 1931, but which a reproduction of was also used in the Free State Handbook as well. So his involvement in these notable publications continues throughout his career. You have someone then as well like Estella Solomons, who, I suppose an interesting point is that both Curnoff and Solomons came from Jewish families, but from very different social class. I suppose Solomons came from quite a middle class established family in the city, whereas Curnoff only arrived in Dublin in 1914 and was very much part of the kind of working lower middle class, I suppose, kind of background. Solomons is a fascinating artist. This is her self-portrait from 1926. She had a studio on Pier Street, and these were the type of works that she was completing there before in the early part of the 20th century. These are both undated, but probably date to around 1910 to 1915 or 16. And I wanted to show them, it was a studio up on the upper level, so you get a real sense of that with the small window here, and this really distinctive background, which is almost like a tricolour as well. You have portraits here for friends, including Kathleen Goodfellow, who wrote under the name of Michael Brennan. Solomons and Brennan joined Cumann na mBan together in 1918, the Ranelagh branch. And the studio that we see here became a refuge for soldiers on the run during the War of Independence. And so she's very much enmeshed in those political circles through the 1920s. But while she's kind of doing that with her political life, her etching, which is really what she became known for rather more so than painting, and she's kind of spearheads part of the etching revival in Ireland. She again is drawn to those parts of old Dublin, the streets that are kind of being changing, being demolished, and that tell sort of kind of part of the history of Dublin. So you have here Carlisle Court and the Leinster Market as well. And just to give you a sense of where they are, this is just a screen grab from the 1847 Ordnance Survey map. So you have O'Connell Bridge here, or Carlisle Bridge as it was called at the time, Delir Street, Hawkins Street, and the Theatre Royal. And then in this in-between space, you have the Leinster Market here and Carlisle Court here. So this is where the screen cinema was up until recently, another change in the city. And if you walk down Hawkins Street today, you'll still see the entrance to where the Leinster Market is. Or well, you can't walk through it anymore, but you can still see a part of it. And this is a photograph from the Walter Osborne archive in the National Gallery, and you can see it shares a lot with Solomon's etching, the quite distinctive shop fronts and stall fronts, and the lamp as well. And that brings you quite nicely then on to Flora Mitchell. Unfortunately, I have no portrait of her to kind of introduce you to her properly. So we know from the Civic Week handbooks that through the early 1920s, Mitchell was very active within Dublin artistic circles. She's exhibiting, and her work is being selected by Hobson for these publications. But really then after the late 1920s, she kind of disappears off the radar. In 1930, she married William George Jameson of the Jameson family, and they largely lived in the Isle of Wight, where he was the sailing master on the Royal Yacht Britannia. Now her husband died just 9 years into their marriage, and Flora then returned to painting and to her art in the mid-1950s. And it's very hard to trace at this stage where she kind of goes in between those two dates. But I suppose her real legacy came in 1966 when she published this wonderful book, Vanishing Dublin, published by Alan Figgis in a series of just 500 or 600 copies. They've become extremely sought after and valuable. And I think if you have one, if you're in your reading room, look after it, because often when they come up on the open market, they are separated out and the illustrations framed separately, which is just an awful thing to think about. And Vanishing Dublin, for me, even though I suppose it fell slightly outside of the date range I had set myself, it encapsulated so many things that have popped up over the course of the 19th and 20th century and brought them together in such a neat way. So even, for example, if you think back to Barton's illustration of Patrick Street, which was before the redevelopment and the Ivy developments here, and Mitchell gives us the after, whereas Barton gives us the before. She also captures parts of Dublin that just aren't there anymore. This is the Irish House on Wood Quay, and of course this was all demolished for the building of the new city council offices. And again, another place that was demolished even by the time, in the time between Mitchell kind of first drawing Weaver's Hall and the time the book came out in 1966, this building was no longer extant. But what you get with these three artists and through the publications that they contributed to is a sense of even someone like Barton, right back in the 1890s, showing Weaver's Hall as a part of Dublin that was disappearing. And by the time Mitchell comes into the 1960s, it has gone completely. Yet in between then you have all of these other artists who were drawn to the same subjects. So that's, I suppose, a very quick kind of trot through how I used some kind of publications and special collections for the book. And I suppose when we think about special collections and art history research, the things that I ended up using might not be the most obvious or the most evident. Even partly for myself, when I think of special collections and art history, you tend to think about maybe highly illustrated books. I'm thinking even of some of the botanical volumes in the that Alex would have looked after in the Botanic Gardens, or illuminated manuscripts, the kind of earlier materials. yet there is so much more to it. And I suppose now how I approach it is to think, well, how can we get other researchers interested in it? How are, when we work with students and researchers, to get them to think about where the illustrations, even if they are just, photographs, tipped in photographs, to think of where they came from, who made them, what are they reproductions of, and how do they contribute to the book, in a sense, as an object and as an artwork or an art object. And there's lots of ways which we can do that. So it's, I've kind of gone full circle here from researcher now to working with people on their own research as well. So I'm going to finish up there, and I'm more than happy to chat about Painting Dublin, but otherwise, thank you so much for having me.